welcome, Natalie, to the Dating Intentionally podcast. How are you?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for asking. It's maybe a little bit heavy because I'm in Southern California right now. We have a lot of fires, so it's a bit sad and heavy, but I'm personally very grateful to be not in it at
hmm
eight something months pregnant. But you caught me at a good time. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It means a lot. I love being
Thank
here.
you. Yeah, I loved stumbling upon your work, and I'm so glad I caught you in this moment where you could still come on the podcast. So I like to ask guests this one question before we get into it, which is, what do you want to be intentional about, or what are you currently being more intentional about? Choose your own adventure on that one.
Well, we just had the new year, and this year I've decided to be very intentional about how I spend my time because with the baby coming, there's certain things I would like to maintain, and I know that's going to require an enormous amount of intentionality and discipline. So those are kind of my focuses right now.
Yes. I mean, hey, I'm rooting for you. Like, it's gonna be challenging, but I love that intentionality and just like really paying attention to how you're gonna protect your time, use your time. That's
And
awesome.
align what you say you want with how you spend your time because it's very easy to say I want this, but then you look at your time and your time doesn't reflect to the priorities that you say that you have, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
actually very challenging to confront yourself with your own BS.
Yes, for sure. It is. It is. Well, that's awesome. Well, I did a deep dive into your podcast and everything, and I know from your story that you've shared that your parents split up when you were like middle school age. And I relate, my parents split up when I was 16, and this had a huge impact on your relationship with your now husband. And you had a ton of doubts through this whole process. But I'm curious to know a little bit more about your dating journey. Looking back, like knowing what you know now, how do you think your anxiety that you had, maybe from your parents' divorce or other things, like impacted when you were dating?
Really good question. I'll try to keep it concise.
No, we have all the
Bel
time.
Well, because I could take 8 hours with all the nuances and all the things I've learned to explain it. But I've actually really never been single. And for since I didn't date as a baby, but starting around age 14, 13, 14, I always had a boyfriend. And I don't know whether that was because I had a very magnetic effect on men or whether I was just always looking for a relationship at that time. Probably a mix of both. But I actually haven't had that many relationships. I had a couple long-term relationships starting around that time. And then I met my husband at age 19, now husband. We dated for about 10 years before getting married. I think if I were to go back and do it again, I would suggest we would get married sooner than that. But that was our journey. We met so young and it took us a while. And I had my foot out the door for 7 of those 10 years where we were dating. A lot of people would find that to be a sign that we just weren't meant for each other. And I wouldn't blame them. But relationship anxiety, and when I say relationship anxiety, I'm referring to the experience of kind of having one foot out the door all the time and having incessant intrusive thoughts. And in pretty much all my relationships, there was always this wavering. And that's normal, I think, in dating. If you're dating to marry or you're dating with the intention of being in a life partnership and having a serious commitment, it would make sense that it would be a heavy decision, a serious decision to make. So, of course, you would have doubts. It's a huge decision to make to commit to someone and build a life with them. But I took it to another level where I would have panic attacks about whether we were in the right relationship or not. And sadly, this was something I did in all of my relationships ever since the parents' divorce. But I don't blame my parents in any way, especially now.
hmm
And what's very interesting is during the time I had all these fears and doubts, it never occurred to me that my parents' divorce was part of the equation. I just thought I was this anxious person, and I thought my partners were not good enough for me. It was only about 5 years ago, and we can talk about that journey, where I kind of ran into a pile of my own bullshit. And I realized that I'd never really processed the the pain of my
Hmm.
parents' divorce. And I also never examined how fearful I was of repeating that pattern. And as a result, my partners were forced under this microscope in order to prevent a divorce from happening. So I had this trauma that said, I never want to get a divorce. So therefore, whoever I meet is going to have to be perfect so that I know that that's never going to happen to me because I don't want to repeat the cycle. That was running starting at age 12. And every single man I was with, though there were few, had to deal with it, especially
Wow.
ironically around Christmas, which
Yeah.
was when my relationship, I would always break up with whoever I was with at Christmas time.
Did was like the timing of your parents' divorce around Christmas also? Like, was
I
that just,
think the
or just because it's like a
pain,
family time?
yes, I think that's when I felt the pain the most. And I
Yeah.
had this subconscious need to feel the pain. And so I would weirdly put myself in that position of heartbreak as a way to
Okay.
face it. So
So
strange.
I have questions. So before you, obviously you did find your way to this kind of root, this answer, this like, oh, my parents' divorce is impacting me. But before you figured that out, what did you think it was? Like causing this anxiety, causing this panic or this putting your partners under the microscope experience?
Oh gosh. And let's not forget all of the rise of social media.
Hmm.
And also, I was raised watching Disney movies. And by the way, I love Disney movies. I was raised to see the things like The Notebook, movies like this. And so that was, I saw my parents' marriage as a failure rather than a completion at the time. So when you see your parents as a failure, you create this reference point and you look for success. And you look around you, and all relationships are flawed, and it's really hard. So you look to find a reference point for what healthy love looks like. And for me, it was The Notebook and Disney. And as I ventured into my 20s, it was Instagram. And that became my reference point for what a good partner was, not realizing that they only
Mm,
show the good parts.
right.
So whenever my partner didn't match up to that, I thought he was the issue rather than the indoctrination of perfect love that we've created and established as a standard.
Understood. I mean, I think a lot of people listening can relate to that. As you were talking, I was thinking like after my parents split, what was my idea of a good relationship? And I'm thinking like I don't think I had one until my mid 20s of an idea of a real couple that I could think of that I was like, that, I want that. And I think about my grandparents who like stayed together and it's like, no, I didn't want that either. Okay, so this comes up a lot with my listeners and my followers on Instagram, and I really have no idea what they mean when they're saying this, but they're always asking me about ROCD, relationship OCD. And I know you're not like
Mhm.
for like you don't formally talk about this in your work, but I know that you also have education, a little bit of education around this. So can you just talk a little bit about what that is?
So I will say that I initially started out talking about relationship OCD when I began sharing my journey. The reason I did that was because when I heard about it for the first time, I read through the list of factors that could kind of self-diagnose you. And I thought, oh my God, I totally have that. The problem is, I'm not a clinician of any kind. So I diagnosed myself, but OCD is something, it's a disorder, which means it's kind of part of the medical model, and it should be diagnosed by a licensed physician or a clinician or something of that sort. And I was in no position to claim my own diagnosis. However, I will say that aside, I have found that the language that I've chosen to use to describe this experience will resonate with people who have a formal diagnosis.
Got it.
But I am not qualified in any way to speak on the treatment of this disorder. I will say that I think anxiety is a human experience, and there's a difference between anxiety and a disorder. You can have anxiety and not necessarily have a disorder or a disease. And arguably, I believe that a lot of these diagnoses, this is my opinion, so you can take it with a grain of salt. If it's useful, take it. If it's not, drop it. But I found that there is a humanness to this. And what a lot of people think is them being as having a disorder is something that is human and normal.
Hmm.
And so I speak from that angle. I take what we might call a more spiritual approach. My background is in yoga and meditation, and then I have all this firsthand experience being in a marriage and being the anxious one in a marriage for so long. So I can speak from that. If you
Right.
want like a clinical approach, you should find someone who specializes in OCD. If you want that, I'm not your girl. But as a human, as someone who has obsessively criticized and nitpicked my partner to shreds, I can speak to the human experience of that because really, at the core of it, it's just an inability to manage terror
Mm.
inside.
Can we talk more about that?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
I definitely relate to so much of your story. Like you talked about going down the internet rabbit hole of like Googling things your partner does and
Yeah.
nitpicking and just really hyperfixating on the things you don't like. So, what was the first like inkling you had that maybe it wasn't your partner and it was you?
I think the moment that sticks out, although I'm sure there were others, it was a few days before my mom was about to get remarried, and I was her maid of honor. And the night before her wedding, I had this panic attack. Go figure, a wedding. Of what timing? I had this panic attack that I had fallen out of love with my partner, now husband. And I literally was like, I don't know if I love you anymore, which is must have been so hard for him to hear.
Wow.
Bless his soul. And I'd done this already a few times. That's a classic relationship anxiety move. It's like, oh my God, I don't know if I love you enough because I wasn't feeling anything towards him. Well, no shit. It's hard to feel something towards someone when you're having a panic attack. Okay. So I didn't know. Anyway, so the night before the wedding, I was supposed to get to my mom's house at 7 a.m. to help her start preparing for her wedding to my stepdad. And they've been together for almost 20 years now. But I was getting ready. I needed to be ready at the house at like 7 a.m. And we stayed up until 3 a.m. crying because I had fallen out of love.
Oh my
And
God.
by grace of God, or I don't know, the divine, the next morning I actually stumbled. I was Googling, and thank you, Google. And I actually stumbled upon Cheryl Paul's work. And I love Cheryl Paul. She takes a very Jungian approach. And she was kind of the first time person I'd ever heard of relationship OCD. And as soon as I heard relationship OCD and relationship anxiety, I felt so seen. And I remember like running out of the bathroom being like, Kristen, my husband, I was like, there's a name for this and other people have it. And I was so relieved. And what's so interesting is like my love feelings actually came back at that time because all of a sudden my shame and my anxiety were just given space and permission to
Mm,
be there. And when that happened, it's something so interesting happens when you let go of shame, your heart opens, and lo and behold, the love feelings can come back. So there's this weird paradox with anxiety that, you know, there's a loop. Like the anxiety prevents the love, which creates anxiety, which prevents the love, which creates anxiety, if you have this belief that you need to be in love all the time.
mm. So you have that belief?
Hmm.
What do you believe now?
Well, I believe that you need to define what love is. And there's different types of love. There's the infatuation experience, which is a lot of sensations and oxytocin and all that. We call that the feeling in love. And
Mm.
it's a rather selfish, egoic thing where that is in part, and I believe, framed by our childhood unmet needs. And
Okay,
all of a
interesting.
sudden, our partner is the one who we perceive is going to finally meet us where we've always wanted to be met. And what we're falling in love with is a dream of never being in pain again, never being lonely again, never being disappointed. That's what we fall in love with. We also fall in love with who we become in their presence or who we would like to see ourselves as in their presence. But in order to be that, we kind of hold this expectation that they need to be a certain way too. That's the
Mm,
problem with kind of the infatuation stage. Over time, you realize that who you thought they were is not who they were. And then you come to the different definition of love, which is a choice. It's something you do and it's
right.
something you offer. So Sometimes the love feelings are there, like when you're on a sailboat, the wind is blowing and you're like, oh, I can
Sunset
use.
and it's yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you're sailing and it's windy and it's blowing the way you want it to blow, and you hardly have to work at it and it just spurs you along.
Mm,
Other times it's a decision and you have to like row the boat when there's no wind,
right.
right?
Right.
So, having a flexible definition of love has allowed me to not freak out when I'm not feeling in love, especially now with a baby on the way. I mean, my husband know we might be at each other's throats for the next 3 years, and we're like, are we good with that? Yes. Okay, we'll recover. We'll go to therapy. Whatever ruptures we have, we'll figure it out. Whereas I think a lot of people think, if I'm in the right relationship or in the right marriage, it's just going to be easy. We're not going to have that experience. But I think buffering for hardship, especially if you're planning for long-term partnership. Think about things like paying a mortgage, having kids, death in the family. What if you have a broken family and you have estrangements, or you have homeless people, or you have alcoholics in your family,
Hmm.
in-laws, old age, hemorrhoids, cancer? I mean, these things are not sexy and not conducive to infatuation, but a lot of people expect that they're going to continue to feel in love as these hard life things happen. And it's a lot of pressure to put on a relationship. So if you
Yeah.
ask me what I believe, I think you have to be comfortable with the ebb and flow if you want to sustain a long-term partnership. Now, if you don't care for that and you don't want to get married or you don't want commitment, that's fine. But then you can just keep chasing different partners
Yeah.
to chase
The
that feeling. And then
infatuation. I think a
if
lot of
what
people
you're
do that.
want, yes, and that's okay too. I do think you're going to run into yourself at some point and realize it's never enough.
Yeah.
But I've always thought that, you know, when you're trying to figure out who you want to commit to, imagine falling out of love with them. Would you still respect them? Would you still like how they show up when you're not in love,
I love that
right?
question. Like, if I fell out of love with this person, would I still respect them? Would I still enjoy like it being in their presence or something?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
if you don't feel romantically inclined towards them, are you still grateful that they're the father of your children? Do you still respect them as a human being? When shit hits the fan, are you like, I mean, I had a miscarriage last year. Do you think that was sexy? Not at all. But my husband was coming in every hour to bring me sweet potatoes, right? So I wasn't feeling in love with him in that moment, but my God, I was thinking, this guy shows up.
Yeah.
And that meant so much to me, and the romance you can cultivate.
Right. Right. Yes. I am a big believer in cultivating the romance. Like, it doesn't have to, the belief that it shows
Yes,
up organically in a long-term relationship is it's one belief I wish everyone would just throw out because it's not something that is always going to be spontaneous. And it's not like it's discounted or worth less if it is something that you put energy into. Yeah, such
100%.
a good point. And I have a question, but I want to get some listener questions. But at first I'm so curious about your husband's side of all of this. Like, on his end, like being with someone who has questioned their relationship several times, like how did he stick it through?
He's very stubborn.
Okay.
We're both very stubborn. And I remember the day that I posted about my journey with relationship anxiety. It was actually in this like yogi Facebook group. It had like 20,000 people in it. And I had finally had like a spiritual awakening actually around this subject. And I posted about it. And I shit you not, Talia, 1,000 people responded. And I thought, oh my God.
Wow.
And I was a
Yeah.
nobody. I didn't have anxious love coach didn't exist.
Right.
And I thought I have no experience, I have no qualifications, I'm in no way, no position to talk about this, but I didn't see anybody talking about it except for Cheryl Paul at the time. And now there's a bunch of us talking about relationship anxiety. But at the time I was saying, hey, a lot of what helped me was some mindfulness practices. And that I was trained to do. And so I did this like beta test group. And I said, hey, I'm going to do this like free beta test called Anxiety Whispers. That was like my little first group program. And it was totally free and donation based. And I just posted it in this Facebook group. And I had like 50, 60 people request to be part of Anxiety Whispers. And I was like, whoa, that's
Yeah.
really talk about proof of concept. And I went to my husband and I said, at this point, I've been teaching yoga for like 6 years and making like nothing. But I was like, hey, I kind of want to talk about this story. Are you okay with that? And his response was, will it make money? Typical guy response.
Oh man, that's funny. I think my husband has like the
Yeah.
same
Yeah,
idea.
yeah, we're all I think we're all dating the same guy. So he said, "Will it make money?" And I was like, "I have a feeling it might." And then it did. And I've always been very transparent about what I can and can't offer. There are people that offer different
Right.
things in this space. Mine is a much more mindfulness approach. And nowadays I talk about masculine, feminine polarity too, and how that relates in Tantra and that stuff.
Hmm.
But he was really grateful because I found out years later that he also had his own relationship anxiety, which there just wasn't space for because I occupied all of it.
Yeah.
Later, I found out he also had doubts. He also wanted to run. He also fantasized about other people. And it was just so humanizing for me to discover that. Hard for me to hear, but then I got to feel what it was like to be on the other end. And I think both of us are just, we've been so humbled by the journey. We want other people to know that they're not crazy and that this happens. And I think that's so he's been very supportive in part because it makes money.
Well,
But
I mean, that's but
also
also it's helping a
because
lot of people. I mean, right, and
that
making people feel less alone, all those things.
guys get
I feel
relationship
for you.
anxiety too.
Right. Oh yeah, for sure. I guess like another question I had about your journey, you said you were had one foot out the door for like over 5 years, like over like half the relationship until you got married. Like, were you silently struggling with that, or did he know that you had one foot out the door? Like, how much did that take up your airspace in your conversations and like in your relationship?
Good question. It wasn't like it was 5 years straight of
Okay.
just, me being
Yeah.
half-assed about the relationship and treating him like crap. It was more like a constant boomeranging.
Okay, yeah, and I relate to that. I had the same thing, maybe for on a shorter time scale, but yes, the boomerang effect. Yeah.
I would push him away and then I would get worried about losing him and then I would snap back. So it was just putting him through that torture for 5 years.
Poor guy.
I know. But in hindsight, there was, and this is why I talk about this, but this is a topic for another podcast. In hindsight, there was also, like I said, a masculine feminine polarity component. We were in a heavily depolarized relationship where we could say that I was more in a masculine energy, which is not even masculine, it was wounded feminine energy. And he was in a more wounded masculine energy, which appeared feminine. So in hindsight, it wasn't just relationship anxiety and trauma. We also had relationship dynamics that were unsatisfying. So it wasn't like the relationship was beautiful and perfect. And I think a lot of people will say in the relationship anxiety space, do you have like an amazing partner and you're just really fucked up? Like, usually it's not that black and white. This brings us to that question that a lot of people have is it just relationship anxiety or am I in the wrong relationship? There's always this question. And to that, I say, if that answer is not obvious, it's possible that your relationship is genuinely unsatisfying in some ways,
Mm.
but there may be some things you can do about it. And when I say masculine, feminine polarity, a lot of people cringe because they think I'm going to be talking about traditional gender roles. And it can be that for you if you want it, but it's more so like playing roles that you actually want to play. There are some areas in my relationship where I love being in a more yang energy. Like when I prefer driving my car and having my husband be the passenger, not right now because I'm pregnant. But
Yeah.
driving a car is a more yang thing and being a passenger is more yin. In that dynamic, my husband and I prefer a flipped
The
relationship.
reverse, yeah. By the way, I do have an episode all about masculine and feminine energy, and I do talk about the yin and yang
Awesome.
factor and like where it comes from. So I'll link that in the show notes because I did a deep dive
Super.
into this a while ago.
Yes.
I personally don't love the frameworks, but I do understand how they can be really useful. And like, I think social media has blown them up out of proportion into something totally different, which is really my problem with it. Yeah.
Thank you for
But I love
saying
the way
that.
you're talking
Yes.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about like, oh, you need to be feminine because you're a woman. That's
No.
BS and that's
Yeah.
restrictive. It's more so, which roles are you playing in which context that you don't enjoy playing? So maybe in
Right.
this dynamic, when I have women who are like, I wish she was more ambitious, I'm like, you're wanting him to be more masculine,
I
right?
have a
You want
question
him to take
though.
more initiative and all that stuff. So
Right.
that also contributed to the relationship anxiety.
Got it. That makes sense. And I'm glad that you're bringing it's like it's never just one thing. And I agree with that. It's never just one thing. But I'm really curious, I think there are a lot of people who are listening to this can relate and have had similar experiences. But why do you think you guys were able to get kind of to the other side of where you have worked through these things? Whereas I think this does break up a lot of people. So like what do you think we need to have? Like what does it take really to get through these really messy issues, but you described it in your podcast like opening up the closet of where an animal died inside. It's like I love that. So, what do you think?
Oh, great question. Thank you for asking it. There have been many deaths in my
Mm,
marriage and relationship over the last 13 years. So the first death was the one that I talked about on my podcast, where I realized, oh, my parents' divorce heavily has affected my beliefs and my inner state. And once I cleared a ton of the grief from that, which actually happened on retreat while I was traveling solo, so that was a really helpful thing for me, was to go be in my own space for a few weeks and not have to caretake and think about him. That can be a middle ground for a lot of people. It's like maybe you don't need to stay around them all the time, but you don't need to break up either. Why don't you go solo travel and find yourself a bit? You can find yourself while in a relationship. I found myself in a very large way, and that after that I started Anxious Love Coach. But that wasn't the end of the journey. We weren't like done because all of a sudden I came back with this unwavering energy. And I remember calling him and saying, I'm in. Sorry for all the wavering, but I'm solid. Now I want to be with you and I want to marry you. And if you propose, I'm saying yes.
And he trusted that.
No, he did not.
Yeah, like what? I'm sorry, I wouldn't trust it.
He was like,
Okay.
you're full of shit. And I was like, I know, I get it. But I didn't waver for 2 more years after that. And then he proposed. And the beautiful thing about polarization in relationships is that when you start occupying a different energy in the relationship, it puts pressure on the entity of the relationship, which puts pressure on your partner to change also. So we had gotten into this comfortable boomerang flow. All of a
Mm,
sudden, I wasn't a boomerang anymore. I was a rock of stability because I had cleared a bunch of trauma, which left space for all of his stuff to come up.
right. Okay. Of course. That's good though.
And all of a sudden, he had a big mental, because he'd been holding the fort down. He was hanging on to the relationship and being the rock for so many years. And all of a sudden, he didn't have to be the rock anymore. I was solid, and all of his trauma came up. So then we had to go through that. And that it was devastating sometimes, some of the things that would come up. And he shared his lamenting that we met so young and he never got to be with other women. And especially with all the messages that guys, young men receive today, that like your desirability is based on your body count. How can
That's such
you?
bullshit. Yeah.
It is, but there's a lot of nuance there
Yeah.
because there is some truth to kind of the mindset of the spreading the seed in the masculine, but women have that too. But anyway, we had to talk about all that stuff, and he had all his things come out of the closet, and we've had to do this a few times.
Hmm.
But I would say and now we're about to have a baby. So our marriage is going to die again. We're going to have to create a new one with
Yeah.
these new people we're becoming. So it's always this breaking and
It's
coming
like the
back
phoenix,
together.
right? It's like dies, comes back. Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
So we've
That's
just died a bunch of times, but we happen to stay together through it. And some people,
I
their
love that.
relationship dies entirely.
That's beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing that and just painting that picture because sometimes I think it's like, oh, you do look at other couples, like, how do they get there? Like, how do they get through that? And I can't seem to have anyone stick around. And on that note, I would love to get into some listener questions. We can do like more of a rapid fire style here. And the first one is this one comes up a lot. Is it acceptable to reject someone in the dating process or further into a relationship because of their relationship anxiety?
That depends on how you define acceptable.
I guess like, is it not valid? Is it like,
Okay,
I guess, is it
according to
okay?
whom?
Yeah, like, is it okay?
Okay, to whom?
Right. Yeah. That's all I got
To
for the listener question. So we
I
can
would start with
interpret that
that.
anyway.
Okay, okay to
Right.
whom? Okay to your parents? okay to God, okay to your friends, okay to that influencer on social media. This is a question of like ethos and morality.
Right.
And it's so subjective, and you'll find some people who say yes and some people who say no. And I think that blind conformity and blind rebellion are two sides of the same coin. They're both fear-based, and it's okay and it's not. But at the end of the
Right.
day, you have to make a decision and you have to own the results of that decision. So it's very possible you might regret it or you might not.
Right. I think that my answer is more like it's okay. It's okay if that's what you want to do. Like, yeah, like you said, own it. And for me, if my relationship is causing me more anxiety than stress, than peace, and I've already taken steps to try and address it, and it's still causing me a lot of stress, then I think it's worth walking away. Yeah.
Yes, and 100%. And it's worth examining why the anxiety is there.
Yeah.
And it's not enough to say, is it okay to stay if I have anxiety? I'm going to say, well, why do you have
Well,
anxiety?
oh no, it's more if the other person's anxiety and
The
other
other
person. Yeah.
person,
Yeah.
same
But that's it.
question.
Same, yeah, same thing.
Why do they have anxiety? Is it because they have trust issues because they've been hurt in the past? Well, that makes sense. They probably need someone who's a bit more stable. Can you provide that? A lot of people who have anxiety, they can be extremely controlling. I know I was. Are you going to be ready for that?
Right.
Um, the other reason they might have anxiety is because of a genuine incompatibility. And the way I see incompatibility is one person has to fundamentally change who they are at their core in order to be in the relationship. You know, I've had relationships end, not really romantic, but I've had friendships and family relationships kind of separate because we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk and we talk, and we get to a point of realizing that we have fundamentally different values.
Yep, for
And
sure.
that basically, you know, you almost need to hug a porcupine. In order to love you, I need to hurt myself. That doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It doesn't.
So that if that's your reason for anxiety, check it's not an incompatibility issue, because that could be, you know, maybe it works for right now, but you might be rightly assessing that you have two different value systems and two different visions for the future.
It's a great answer. I love the porcupine thing.
Mm-hmm.
So another listener question I got was, what's up with feeling bored in a relationship and why that starts making you feel anxious? Like there's a connection between feeling so stable that it's boring and then you think something's wrong.
Oh man, I have so much to say about this. I'll try to keep it
Yeah,
quick
no
and get
worries.
these rapid fire questions. Okay, we have to remember that our ancestors used to just sit around the fire and talk and do nothing. And
Sounds
they didn't
nice.
think that was boring. So they were just happily existing peacefully around the fire. There was no cell phone, there was no nothing. And so a lot of what we're experiencing in when we say we're bored is a result of like a dopamine addiction withdrawal. So if you are used to constant stimulation and constant deep conversations and constant expansion, and you're not tuned in, like I said, to the ebbs and the flows, and because boredom can be seen as peace from another angle, right? Boredom is actually a resistance to nothing happening. So it's one thing to like be guided by your desires, and that comes from a place of love and inspiration. But it's another thing when you have a resistance to nothingness, which, let's be real, most of us do, including myself. If I'm just sitting there, I want to grab my phone. If my husband and I are sitting side by side, it's tempting sometimes to be like, entertain me. We look at our partners like they're Amazon Prime or something, and they should immediately provide us entertainment. That's not what long-term relationship is about. So the simplest thing I can say is like, get over it. You're
Yeah,
gonna
I
be
mean,
bored sometimes. It's
I love
okay.
this. I have been calling 2025 like my, in a good way, boredom year. I just want to be very steady. And I don't really want anything to happen this year that much. Like things are going to happen, right? Things happen, like life happens, but I'm like so excited to just like sit in my life and like by the end of the year, like not much has changed. Like that's
Oh,
what I really want this year to be because I want to be okay with that. And also, like, I love my life right now. Like, I'm loving it. And I'm like, I don't want anything to change just for a second, just for like, just a second.
Thank you for saying that. I hear you saying that you're choosing like intentional spaciousness.
Yeah, and peace and just being like, okay, I don't like my husband was gone this week on a business trip and for the first time in forever, instead of watching TV, like I sat on the couch and read and it felt weird at first being like, oh, I'm not watching TV while looking at my computer and my phone right now. What's wrong? No, I'm like gonna sit and just literally look at and read a actual book. And there was no music, no sounds. It was so nice. I need more of this. Yeah.
Even right now, just like the spaces between our voices in the conversation, sometimes I notice this just on my podcast or on Instagram. I feel like I have to fill the space all the time, and it just becomes very noisy. It's really, I enjoy like silent lingerings now, but I used to interpret that as boring.
Yeah. No, it's, I hope listeners, I hope we were inspiring you to embrace oh, what's another word for boring? Peace? I don't know, like just stillness.
I would actually say boredom is a state of agitation. Like I
Right.
said, boredom itself is a very agitated state. And like I said, it's a resistance to nothing. And a lot of times, in my experience at least, a lot of times what's happening is something is surfacing inside of that space. And if you don't want to look at that, you'll be like, I need something to fill the space because I don't want to look at what's coming up in this spaciousness. So if you're finding that something is surfacing in the space that you set aside to do nothing, chances are whatever surfaces needs attention. And once that moves through you, through mindfulness, through movement, through embodiment, which is a lot of the stuff that I teach my clients, once it moves through, there might be something else that needs to move through after that. But at some point, just kind of like a dirty faucet that you let run for a long time and it goes from black to clear,
Right.
eventually you arrive at pure spaciousness. And it's actually a very blissful state. So I would say that boredom is a resistance to what surfaces when nothing is happening.
It's a really good way to frame it. And my therapist used to get at me when I would say I'm bored. She would like definitely pull that
Poke
exact
what
thread.
is
Yeah, she was
surfacing
like, "What
in
do
the
you mean you're
space.
bored? Why do you keep saying that? Like, what does that mean?" She was definitely trying to get that message across.
Yeah, it could be your withdrawal from your dopamine addiction, and that
Totally.
needs to be cleared out. You can jump up and down, you can shake your body. Ah, I'm agitated. You could have a lot of energy that wants to go someplace. So it's not just about like get over it. I mean, I know I said that, but like, but it's also channeling that impulse into something
Hmm.
creative. And what you're experiencing as boredom, someone else could be in that same room with you and not feel any resistance at all. So, this would happen to me in my relationship all the time when I had relationship anxiety. I would be like irritated or anxious or feeling like we should be talking about something important or this moment should be more significant than it appears to be. And I would like check in with my husband and he would just be like,
Yeah,
I'd
that's
be
how
like,
my
what are you
husband is
thinking?
too.
What are you thinking about? Nothing. And I'm like, what do you mean you're not thinking? What do you mean nothing? You're thinking about nothing? Like, actually, yes, he's thinking about nothing. And I would hate him for that.
It's like, how do you do that?
How do you do
What you
that?
said reminded me of like my this one time my ex and I took a cross country road trip. And I remember at the end of the road trip reflecting, being like, we didn't talk about anything deep that entire time. And feeling like I was partially frustrated, but also partially like fine with it. Like, okay, that's all right. Like, why do I
And we
feel
make
like we
that
need
mean
to,
that we're disconnected and we're not.
yeah, why like, I was like, why do I feel like we have to talk about deep things to connect? We don't. Like, and that was like a good little lesson for me. And yeah, it is this like, where does that pressure even come from to like constantly be like talking and like fixing and like getting into it?
Well, you have to examine what ideal you're comparing this moment to.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it.
What's the perfect moment you think you should be having right now? And that gap causes pain.
Right. Right. Instead
Where
of just being
someone
in the
else
here and
could
now.
be, yeah, and someone else could be looking at your situation that you're in right now, thinking, wow, their relationship looks so solid. Meanwhile, you're like having a panic attack internally.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Natalie, this has been awesome. We're just out of time here. You are so insightful. I appreciate you for sharing all of your insights with us just so candidly. And I just appreciate you. So, where can we find more of you?
Yeah, well, I'm about to disappear off the face of the planet for an unseen point of time because I might go into labor any day. But I do exist on social media, and I'm actually going to be pretty active on my email list. Look me up at Anxious Love Coach. You can go to my website, my Instagram. I would say those are kind of the most popular places I'm in. I've got this like monthly Patreon call that I really love. So people come and ask me questions there, and I record my little voice notes whenever I'm inspired. So I'm there. Just look up Anxious Love Coach and you'll find me.
Thank you so much. This has been so great.
Oh, it really has. And thank you so much. And best of luck to you also. And thank you for, if you are listening today, thank you for your time.